Does the sound all right? Okay. No? That's the darn thing.
Which I believe we will all share. It is that the general elections may hasten a day when there will be employment for all, when labor may be duly honored and receive its due reward.
At any cost? At any cost? How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that?
Just watch me.
You've got Rasminsky at the Bank of Canada saying the country is going to pieces practically every year for the last 5 or 6 years.
Ed Turner, just one second.
Once any
you
nation,
do not have a monopoly on patriotism. And I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian.
Hello and welcome to the podcast of the Red Ensign. This is the 5th full episode of the podcast. I'm here with my regular co-host, Cryptos. Cryptos, how are you doing?
I'm doing really well, actually. I just realized that this is actually my 5th recording this week. So,
yeah, it's been a busy week for both of us. Lots of outside, not just this week, but over the last couple of weeks, lots of outside appearances, many more than many more than I typically do anyway. Do you want to talk about
I usually do say one a week or so. Yeah. So, sorry about that.
I know you did an episode of your podcast, The Christian Ghetto, where I was a featured guest on forgiveness right in time for Easter. What else have you done recently that people might be interested in having a look at?
So I was on Big Tuna's, and he's a young man who is a very like a bright young man, and he has a podcast, and I'm trying to get Cast Your Nets, and where he's been just bringing people on that he knows in the Twitter circles, and it was kind of funny because Big Tuna got drawn into being a friend of a friend into a much larger circle of people who have much bigger accounts than he does, and has made good use of it to sort of ring people up and say, hey, how would you like to come on my show and talk about your favorite Bible passage? And it's really kind of a neat thing to do. So I did that with him, and we talked about Jacob and Esau. Then I went on Patrick Casey's show. I don't know if people will remember, there was about a year ago or so, Patrick and I had a small, a disagreement over whether or not white was really a proper ethnic category. Yeah, a real category. Unfortunately, YouTube nuked his YouTube channel, and the video got taken down, and he reached out to me and said, we should probably talk. And so he had me on actually to understand some of the Canadian reaction to the Trump tariff regime. So it gave me an opportunity to explain sort of the basics of, because he still operates in this liberal conservative framework, a very like ideological concern. And I tried in 30 minutes to explain it to him, and then also how it had the exact opposite effect that people would have expected to have from south of the border. And then we talked about Elul for the other half of it. And then I was invited on by the North Carolina chapter of the Old Glory Club to talk about fatherhood of all things. And that was a really good conversation. And I invited in my group chat, the Christian Ghetto, I just sort of put out a general invitation for people to join me. And Black Horse came on, and as did Ron Dodson. And the three of us kind of tag team to talk with a bunch of young guys about what it means to raise kids as a Christian father. And so I think that was really good. That space should be online. I think they saved it, and that should be available. And then
the last thing I wanted to note is you appeared with Semiagog to try to explain Canada.
Oh, yes.
As part of a panel of his Canadian guests. This is an interesting aspect of what goes with this show. We very often get invited places to explain Canada to outsiders or explain Canadian politics to outsiders. I was recently on with Kofefe Anon on his podcast to be interviewed about Canadian politics, which was kind of interesting. I was most of that's paywalled, so I won't chase the readers too hard about it. But it's an interesting repeating experience to go on international shows and be asked to explain Canadian politics, because to them, they expect Canadian politics to be like a mirror of American politics. And they see like a conservative party and a liberal party as the two dominant parties. And then they think that they're going to map on American politics to that lens. And you'll hear them say things like Alberta is the Texas of Canada. And that frame is, that's not the worst frame in the world, but it definitely loses a lot of resolution as to how Canadian politics actually works. So it's interesting because on the show I did with Kofefe Anon, it turns out the position of the E-right broadly in a lot of cases is actually to side with the Laurentian elite in our local conflict rather than decide against the Laurentian elite, which is an interesting, though not that unexpected reaction when you think about the kind of longstanding positions of the old E-right.
Yeah, and you get the question of like, why aren't Canadian conservatives more conservative? And you're like, well, that's not the point of the conservative. That's just a name that's attached to the party. I mean, they used to be called the progressive conservatives.
We really should go back to calling them the progressive conservatives, just so that people can understand that the ideological tag means absolutely nothing.
Absolutely nothing. They're not really conservative. And this is the thing you have to explain to people. They're not really conservative. And the policy difference. And this is how somebody like Mark Carney could come in and completely steal Pierre Poilievre's complete platform, and nobody bats an eye. Like nobody. like nobody calls him out for what's the phrase, for when you radically switch your position, and it just seems completely natural here in Canada that this is the kind. So then there is a pull towards a unified politics of battling interests, and it's still Americans struggle to grapple with it because everything. The surface expression of ideological battle is so much stronger in the US than it is in Canada, and that makes it much harder to pierce through that ideological veil to see the actual interests that are competing beneath the scenes. And if you get into sort of Kremlin,
if you start looking at the competing interests in American politics, people scream at you. They absolutely they cannot stand the idea that there are political actors in the American system that represent interests rather than ideas. And if you take an event like the tariff market crash,
that was going to be my point exactly.
And you start to look at, okay, well, what are the interests here that are supposed to be that have shares of sovereignty in the American system? How are they going to look at this? How are they going to react? And what does that say about what the next moves are going to be? People just lose their mind. And so I'm taking a long break from commenting on American politics.
Although I might suck you in and we'll do it next week, maybe.
We'll see. I'm tired of getting yelled at. I got I did my what might be my last appearance on that topic for a while with Geo this week. Geo put out a long. I actually expected most of that to be paywalled, but Geo chose to put out more than an hour of it on his YouTube channel, so people can check that out if they're interested. We talked about a lot of stuff, but Gio's a great guy. You should follow his account if you don't already. Real kind of character of the E-right. I'm hoping to have him on to talk about Canadian culture at some point here.
Yeah, that'll be a fun conversation. It's Gio is just, and Gio gets it. But Gio is his own sort of thing, and it's just it's always a fun ride when you're having a conversation with Gio, because you never really know quite what's going to happen once it gets going.
Well, he's an archetypal artist, right? He has that kind of different point of view, and it'll be interesting to see how he reacts to a variety of things. Now, since we've started talking about about Canadian politics a bit, we have to pull up this very important piece of art given to us by the Red Ensign's local artist. The video game introduction between Pierre Polyev and the robot that is Mark Carney, battling over the Canadian over Canada in electoral politics. What did you learn from the great French language debate?
Absolutely nothing. My French isn't good enough but from the reportings from inside the behind the screen from friends and mutuals who could actually speak French well enough to understand it, that in theory they were supposed to talk about immigration, but from what I understand, because that way nobody in English Canada could actually understand what they were saying, and the French lapped that stuff up, and you can say pretty much anything you want about immigration in Quebec because you can't do any damage there. So you say it in French, and then you don't have to worry about your English audience because nobody's going to report it. And so it's like I have no idea. I don't even think they actually said anything really inflammatory.
No, my impression is they said like nothing, basically.
Nothing. And they just basically decided the whole goal of for those who are listening, American audience or whatever, the whole point of a French language debate is to demonstrate to the Quebecois that you speak French credibly enough not to be a total tool.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much the point of it.
Well, the other point of it is to demonstrate that you care about issues that Quebec cares about. Interestingly, my read is that, first of all, Carney can't speak French credibly, so that's definitely one piece of it. He might as well have not shown up based on what I heard from my French native speaking friends. And the other thing is, I don't think either party really did a good job demonstrating that they cared about anything that Quebec cared about. Mark Carney went out there and promised to spend, $6 gazillion on every possible social program.
$1 quintillion in the French nation.
Yes, and everybody knows that this is a lie. Canada is broke. The oil market is currently in free fall, which means Canada's going to get a lot broker. And so, there's a bunch of meaningless hot air about new spending programs that are definitely not going to happen. And as far as I can tell, there's zero overlap between Pierre Polyev and the politics of any person in Quebec.
Like zero.
So, and then Jagmeet Singh was kind of a clown because he's kind of a clown in general. And
does he even speak French?
He does a little bit, but my impression is that it's not good.
Worse than Carney?
That's a good question. I didn't ask any French-speaking person whether Singh's French or Carney's French is worse. But anyways, that's...
So it gave the bloc just basically a free form to sort of bash on the other parties as like not getting us.
Yeah, as far as I can tell, people said that there are kind of mixed reviews about the bloc because I get the impression that French ethno-nationalists aren't all that happy with the Bloc Québécois as representation for them in federal politics. But
interesting,
given how unappealing the rest of federal politics is for Québécois, I just don't know where they go. Right? Are you going to vote for Pierre Polyev?
That is, just that sort of sums up Canadian politics in a nutshell. It's like, which candidate is the most least appealing?
Well, I do think that it's a bit of a tragedy for Bernier that he wasn't able to get to the French language debate.
I know, because he does speak French.
He speaks French well, and he would have found a way to talk about immigration.
For sure.
And I think if he could have gotten on that stage with a French language audience of that size, he might finally win his Beau seat and get to,
Oh my word! He would be red meat for those that there's a lot of people hungry out there for red meat on immigration, and
especially in Quebec, it's very, very unpopular. So
he could have done himself a lot of favors out there, and that's probably why he was excluded. So because nobody wants Bernier up on stage actually talking about stuff that people really care about.
Yeah, well, that's one of the interesting aspects. We'll talk about this more when we get the English language debate here eventually. But my impression is of this entire election campaign is that all messaging on things that actually matter to the future of Canada must be subtextual. So you have confused subtextual messages from Carney as to whether or not he's going to send the immigrants back. We've talked about that, on the
is the
Carney
pivot
moment.
real?
Yeah, is the pivot real? Well, in 1 minute you have him talk with his sound bites about the French, English, and Native Canadian historical founding peoples of Canada. In another minute, you have him going and taking whatever it is, Sikh New Year's or whatever it was he did for that photo.
And then getting up and talking about his commitment to transgenderism, of course.
Well, I mean that's a bit different, right? Because that's an issue that is red meat really for the blue Ontario base and maybe Alberta. It's not red meat in the same way in Quebec, where issues of identity have more currency than issues of kind of culture war.
That is true.
So
that's true. And also you do need to, and this is the thing that people forget, that that there are certain exigencies that even the CPC and the Liberal Party as frontmen for other interests, that in order to gain the legitimacy that the popular vote gives you, which is it's a necessary part of the system, that if you've propagandized your people to think a certain way, you still have to shore up your base. These are fundamental realities of doing retail politics. And if retail politics are your fundamental legitimating mechanism, then you can only stray so far from the propaganda that you've used for the last 25 to 50 years. Otherwise, you lose your own base, and it gets very problematic. So, this was part of the problem that we had, is like, can the Liberals actually pull off the pivot because of the long history of propaganda that they've done to maintain and shore up their base?
Yeah. Speaking of the Liberals, I want to take a second here. And so we have Carney's slogan going into the election, elbows up. It's time to take a minute to look at the elbows up meme and think about it. So we're going to start with one of my favorite videos of all time.
Bobby thought he hit his head on the boards. And when he saw it, but here he comes now. Watch Pat Quinn. Wham! Now he said, wait a minute. He hit me with an elbow. Now he's out cold. Now watch this here. He comes around again in slow motion. I hope you're right. Now watch the elbow. Watch the elbow. He'd get 40 games now if he ever, bang, knocked him cold. I'll tell you that right now. Is that a beauty hit or what? Charging or an elbow? I told Bobby he didn't believe me. Bobby said, Ed Bigger, he did. Now here he goes. Cheevers after Forbes Kennedy. Salt of the earth Bob Kennedy. Watch the fan nail him. Watch it. Bang. You think the fans...
So here we have elbows up Mark Carney drawing on this like incredible boomer meme.
We're going to do dirty hockey to our enemies.
Yeah.
And,
what year was
elbows
the
up
Pac-Man hit? That's got to be like 1960.
It's Bobby Orr, so it's like that's a long time ago.
Yeah. So just to get a sense as to the age of the memes that are at the core of the Liberal campaign, this is Boomer Central.
Their voting base are all boomers. That's the people that vote for them.
Well, that's what they're trying to do. Their campaign is targeted at that's their target audience. That at least the target audience that's outside of their patronage network. And it's working. It's working when you talk to people on the ground. It's disturbing, but it's working.
Oh, of course it is working, and it plays into there is that portion of Canadian culture where, at that historical moment after the American Revolution, and you had the northern territories in Canada, in the East Coast and Ontario, Upper Canada, Quebec, Lower Canada, and Rupert's Land and all these different places that. In theory, all of these could have become separate, distinct states. That was an open question before the time of Confederation. But America fought and the British fought 3 wars to prevent those remaining colonies from joining the U.S. Many of the early settlers in Canada were loyalists who fled various things that were being done to them by the revolutionaries to encourage them to support the revolutionary movement. And so they came north and settled. And so there was a sense where at that period of time, we're stronger together than we are apart. And so there is a portion of Canadian identity that is, we don't want to be American. Now, there's a lot of ties, and it's like nobody hates America here, but there is a strong sense that, like, while we love you guys, we don't want to be you. And so as soon as Trump said, well, we're going to make you the 51st state, he touched a portion of the Canadian lizard brain and just activated it. And the Liberal Party, and this is the thing, because the Albertan interests of selling oil and other minerals and resources to the U.S. as their primary goal, were seen as untrustworthy vis-a-vis. They're too much in love with America to adequately protect Canadian interests. And so the Liberals jumped right on that and presented themselves as the guardians and the safekeepers of Canadian values, and everybody ate it up. And then you think about the change, because during COVID, if you flew a Canadian flag, you were a person who had unacceptable values. And now if you fly a Canadian flag, you are salt of the earth, one of God's people, a true Canadian to the core, and a devout member of the Liberal coalition. And this happened in a matter of days, hours, that they managed to flip this switch.
Well, I mean, in some ways, I think these kinds of boomer hockey memes are just brilliantly deployed. They're world-class propaganda to kind of for the target audience that they're attached to, right? The target audience that they're attached to understands Canada as a political arrangement between multiple peoples, designed to protect those peoples and their identity against American interests. Elbows up, classic kind of reference to one of the few things that those people share in common, and the kind of scraps that they've had, like the kind of scraps that they've had between themselves inside the vehicle of acceptable Canadian national expression. So they've done a nice job, like at a value-free level, of getting that message across, and they've done a masterful job in getting rid of Trudeau as the locus of kind of hatred against that identity. And I don't think they knew that they were going to be able to run against the Trump tariffs the way they have been able to when they dumped Trudeau. But I think fortune has been kind to them in the turning of events.
Well, and you think about it, like, as the Liberal Party, in response to COVID, printed a whole bunch of money, right? And then they raised the minimum wage, created inflationary pressures, and then tried to fob it off on large corporate, like the grocery trains and so forth, that they were, so it got so bad, like the Liberal Party, because now you have the party attacking its primary support base, which are, like the Weston family. So the Westons actually came out and issued a statement that, like, this is not us, like, we're not trying to hose you at the grocery store. We're dealing with all of these other economic pressures, blah, 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 blah. But and so in this transformation, what you see now is on the grocery store, little Canadian tags beside all of the Canadian products. So all of a sudden now, all of these corporate interests are good citizens. So it allows the reintegration of the elites back into the party. They don't have to propagandize against their own corporate interests to secure voters. They can now all be united together in this grandness. So The corporations can make money off of it because people now doing the duty and buying Canadian. Now the Westons who own like major portions of the retail grocery industry and the food production agriculture industry are now Canadian heroes because they can broadcast all of the products that are Canadian made, and they become heroes of Canada. And like you say, the propaganda effort is brilliant from top to bottom, and the corporate world is all on board. Everybody is aligned to Canada first.
Yeah, they managed to reintegrate the elite interests of the Liberal Party and the base interests of the Liberal Party, and all they had to do was put certain communities that they imported as clients on the side shelf for the moment. So, interesting political moment. We'll see how it plays out. On this podcast, we do not endorse either the Western or the Laurentian elite. We simply observe their battle. So away they go. On the other side of the ledger, we had an interesting moment from Mr. Poilievre going into the election, making his pitch. Let's have a look at him.
We had a tradition in this country before this government where you could come from places, the conflict-ridden places in the world, and you would leave the fight behind. You might have a debate about the politics of that place when you sat down in a coffee shop in Montreal or Toronto, but it never overflowed into street violence. We need to get back to that. You should know, we welcome people in this country. Sure, bring your culture, bring your traditions, bring your family, but do not bring foreign conflicts onto our streets. We're going to have peaceful streets again, and we're going to be united. All of us should consider ourselves Canadian first and put foreign divisions behind it.
Yeah, okay. So what's he trying to do here? What's he trying to do here? I mean, there's
how much time do you have?
There's layers to this. The obvious thing that he's trying to do is he's trying to address Israel-Palestine without addressing Israel-Palestine. So he's trying to find a way to say that you're allowed to come to Canada as a Muslim. We want Muslim immigration, and yet you have to put aside the foreign conflict, which is definitely in no way an inextricable element of the Islamic religion. Definitely not. And you have to transform your culture and your community from a culture and community into, you have to tokenize it, and you have to make yourself part of the kind of gray goo of the urban monoculture in Western countries. That's what he's actually saying.
And then there's also a side message to the Khalistani Sikhs and to the Indian community. It's this thing of like, we want to do infinity immigration, but you immigrate. We want everybody to know we're serious, that when the immigrants come here, we need them to know that it's really, really important that you leave your old culture behind and you become Canadians.
But it's not you leave your old culture. You only leave the conflicts behind. You bring your culture.
Oh, that's right, because we want the food and the recipes for the food.
Yeah, because the basic, I mean, the question I have is, who is this for? Because nobody who is under 40 who has lived in this country believes any of this. Believes that this is possible. Believes that it's like, even if it was desirable, it's just not how any of this works.
And there was a really, really good post that came out not too long ago. We'll link to it. It's called, now it was written for the American context, but it's called The Assimilation Myth America, looking at the idea of the melting pot. And these authors on a number of levels look at a lot of the common memes and tropes that surround the notion of immigration, but particularly mass immigration. Yeah. That when communities come here or people come here, that somehow they can rapidly assimilate to the new culture. And they argue, and there's a significant amount of research detailed in the piece, that when you look at the better studies, you do the proper analysis of good data, the opposite is actually true, is that community identity persists a lot longer over time, that their cultural habits persist for a lot longer than people realize, and their cultural character persists for a lot longer than people realize. And not only this, but the social station of people from the old country also then persists in the new country. So if you bring in elites, those people become elites. Now, they don't culturally assimilate. They still retain their culture, but they retain a lot of the cultural care, or a lot of the habits and personal qualities that made them elite in their old country, make them elite and ready to be elites in this country. The social underclasses that come from these other countries, the things that make them the social underclass generally make them the social underclass up here. And so when you look at the data, typically populations don't really move. And so if you bring in, like as Polyev is saying, if you bring in people from war-torn regions to rescue them from poverty, to rescue them from war, they're going to bring all the habits of a war-torn population. They're going to bring all the habits of a poor population here, and they just set up here. But then with their thing, and they note in this piece also then that when people come, they do adapt and change somewhat, but they also then change the culture around them. The example they use in the piece is that from the US is that nobody ate Italian food in the US until you had mass Italian immigration. Then everybody ate Italian food, and it seemed like a completely normal thing to do. And the Italians still ate Italian. They didn't give up Italian food. And so, but this is the food is a nice kind of friendly example of ways in which the immigrant populations influence the base populations. If you say, for example, do business with the Indian community, that's a very, very different culture for doing business. And they don't use a rules-based order in India and Pakistan. They use a system where it's about favors. So you do me a favor, I do you a favor. And if it's a good for you and good for me, then it doesn't matter if it's not good for a third party. So the idea of fiduciary duties, not a thing in India, the way they are here. A rules-based order, not a thing in India. And so, but in order to do business now in Canada, you have to learn how to grapple with a world in which all of the rules that you've done business in for like forever, since like the 1500s, are now being challenged by this stable immigrant community because they don't do business like you do. They do business like they do back home. And so they're bringing and Canada is now going to be changed because of that. The U.S. is going to, they talked in the piece about Mexican gangs and so forth coming up. The people who have a lot of degree of criminality in Mexico, guess what? They have high degrees of criminality when they come to the U.S. And so these types of things. So in the same thing, when there's a high degree of criminality that when people come from the Indian community, you may not want to look at the statistics, but when you look at the top 10 most wanted in Toronto, there's very few Europeans on that most wanted list these days because these types, and these are the kind of things. So this piece really notes this. And so when Polyev is saying, like, there's no magic dirt. I wrote a thread about this morning. There's no magic dirt, and there's nothing magic about Canadian culture that's going to, magically cleanse these people when they arrive in our context of all of their previous cultural habits and ways in doing things. It just isn't the case. And so for him to try to get up and argue this, like you say, anyone under the age of 40 knows this. And now a lot of mainstream research is out there to back this up.
Well, the other thing that I think is interesting here is you've talked a lot about the cultural elements that these people bring with them. But if you look at the Israel-Gaza conflict as played out on the streets of Canada, it's kind of fascinating because the tactics being employed are tactics that make no sense in the Canadian context. Canada is not the United States. Canada does not finance the state of Israel to any significant degree. Canada doesn't have, there aren't Canadian anti-rocket missiles forming the Iron Dome for Israel. It's just, that's not the case. And so the position of the Canadian government on the Israel-Gaza conflict matters almost not at all. So if you were able to flip the Canadian government, I don't even actually know which direction it's currently oriented. It's kind of a little bit ambiguous. But if Canada had a hardcore Zionist government, that would not matter. And if Canada had a hardcore anti-Zionist government, that would also not matter. We don't project power to that degree, and yet still we have these massive protests and reaction against these massive protests, as if flipping the Canadian government's position on this matter mattered at all. And so not only do people from these jurisdictions take their cultural habits, but because they don't know anything about the Canadian government particularly, they make all kinds of weird assumptions about how they should behave politically in order to get their view across, right? As if coming out and rallying against, quote unquote, whatever term you want to use is to disparage Israeli actions in Gaza, as if coming out and doing that is going to have some impact towards stopping them. The whole thing is very silly, and it contributes to this. It contributes to this ongoing way in which the government of Canada is able to distract from the actual politics of Canada. In some ways, we're inching towards the world that the US lives in, where nobody actually ever talks about interest politics. Nobody ever actually talks about the real politics of the country. They talk about this layer of stuff that is that sits ephemerally on top of it. And in my opinion, one of the strange epiphenomena of mass immigration is that we get drawn into this world where our discourse becomes about politics on which we have no bearing on what actually happens here. The Khalistan thing is the same thing, right? The government of Canada's position on whether or not there should be a Khalistani state does not matter. It's not going to, the Indian government is not going to collapse under Canadian pressure and grant independence to Khalistan. It's just not, right? And so you have these political movements that are diaspora movements that are taking actions locally here in Canada that make no sense. And they just disturb the quiet of our streets, and they just distract from the actual politics of Canada. And it's a very weird thing.
In some ways they make sense as long as you understand that Canada is a client state of the United States. So when Blue America is in charge and you want to send signals that loyal client states.
They make sense in like the most ridiculous way. Okay.
Well, yeah. So in a sense,
you're going to send a signal up via like the Canadian government that Blue America should be more anti-Zionist, right? This is the stupidest, like most marginal movement of politics that you could possibly make. And you're going to go and like put yourself out there on Canadian streets to try to do this. It's habit from the old country is the best way.
Well, and that's part of it. But the Canadian government is signaling to others, around the globe, in a sense, it's a way of virtue signaling that we allow this type of protest to happen because we've embraced the character of our immigrant peoples, and so they. It becomes almost like having BLM riots in Europe, where there's in places where there's no one of African descent actually lives, and yet you're having a BLM protest. Yeah, and there is something of that character to this here, where people who are here from past. So again, like you say, you get these absolutely meaningless political demonstrations, and they're merely there to simply prove that Canada is a good global citizen, and that we're integrating we're open to our immigrant communities, and we're integrating them well into our society.
That's what they prove.
Complete nonsense.
That's what they prove from the point of view of the Canadian establishment, but from the point of view of the migrants who actually participate in them, this is just a con job.
Yeah. Oh, exactly.
a great way to waste a Saturday afternoon doing, great deal of heat and noise signifying nothing.
But what it does do, though, from the point of view of, if we're looking at, like, take for example Poilievre's, his
it reinforces,
like
it reinforces the clan and the tribe, right?
Yeah, and what it's basically says, that allowing these types of protests to happen, if this is a means of signaling Blue America, right? But what you're doing then is you're saying, in effect, they're giving the exact opposite message of what the elites are actually saying. So on one level, they say, well, you need to leave these disputes behind. You need to integrate into Canadian society. But then they allow these protests to happen. If they were really serious about it, you would send out riot cops, bang heads, and put these things down. And you would send the message very, very clearly that this will not be tolerated in Canada. If you want to be in Canada, this kind of nonsense doesn't happen. But they continue to allow it to happen. And so everybody knows that, when Poilievre gets up and says this, it's a completely empty thing to say, because he doesn't mean it at all, because they're never going to enforce it and they're not going to make it happen. And so it's just going to continue. And when
he says we used to have a deal, everybody knows that's a lie, because if we
there was never any deal.
If we used to have this deal, we wouldn't have had the last 40 years of, what was it? The Tamil Tigers shutting down the Gardiner Expressway. We wouldn't have had any of this crap. So we didn't used to have a deal like that. We've never had a deal like that. At least not since like the 40s or the 50s, right? When we probably the last time we had a deal like that was during the First World War, when we made the Germans rename Berlin to Kitchener.
Oh my word. Yeah, that's
that's the last time we had that deal, was when all the German towns in southwestern Ontario all got new names. Suddenly
English
there's
names.
Waterloo and Kitchener and all of these places.
Yeah.
But that's a long time ago. That's not how Canada has been in
before I was even born.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
so this is the kind of thing, though. And so what you then get then is the implicit message is received from the immigrant communities that they can continue to more like effectively colonize Canada and make them into places where they're like, literally, you don't have to make any effort to assimilate at all in any way. And so, and they're being brought in such numbers. So for Poilievre to say, yeah, we're going to keep bringing in people from the outside world, but you know what? You need to behave well and leave your business from the old country behind you. Nobody believes it. And it's just merely the kind of performative thing he says so that he doesn't get in trouble from the Canadian media, which are all owned by his opponents.
What Poilievre is actually saying is kind of twofold. The first thing that he's saying, I'm on Team Zionist, which is fair enough. And then the second thing that he's saying is that mass immigration is going to continue and you're going to accept it. And the third thing he's saying is that we're going to continue lying about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the actual message. It's entirely subtextual. And if you just listen to the clip, none of what he's actually saying, none of the words correspond to the message, which is one of the themes of this election campaign. None of the words correspond to the actual underlying politics that are going on.
Well, and this loops back to something that, we've been talking about in terms of real power politics and what you hear and say. So, we've been talking about so if we look south of the border for a bit, when you have the whole notion of the tariffs and kind of what's been going on and why is there all of this flip-flopping and so forth. And part of trying to figure that out is the disconnect between, as we say, the surface messaging and what's not being said and what's the subtext there. And then trying to do the Kremlinology of, who's going in and out of the Kremlin, who's got the ear of Trump and which voice is speaking to him today. Because, that's really where the real analysis would be, is a sense of which political interests have his ear. And is that shifting because events on the ground? Okay, so we're not going to
have this whole discussion. So
again, but yeah, no, I know. But we get the same thing in Canada, though, where much of the politics on the surface has that kind of fakish feel about it, because they can't actually talk about the real interests. And so you have to do a kind of, reading between reading between the lines, understanding what they're not saying, and then beginning to ask the questions of, okay, we know he's lying to us. So what are the real power interests at play that he doesn't want to tell us? And what is he actually going to do when he gets into office? And so if you focus on kind of the sports center version of politics, where you just listen to what Poilievre is saying, you're going, and if you think he's going to save you from the liberals, nothing of the sort is going to happen. And everybody not everybody knows it. Some of us know it, but a significant portion of the Canadian population doesn't, unfortunately. That's one of the reasons why we're here, is to try to hopefully raise people's awareness of what you're hearing is not actually what you should be hearing.
Well, and trying to bring discussion of Canadian politics away from propaganda and toward the interests that are represented by the various groups that are engaging in politics.
Yeah, and how to parse the propaganda properly so you can hear what you're actually being told, versus what the surface messaging is saying.
Speaking of surface messaging and propaganda, there is what I think is an absolutely amazing pair of artifacts that have been produced by the CBC in the last, 7-8 years. 2 shows, Letterkenny and what's the other one? Shoresy, that are shows about rural white Canada. And as I understand it, up until 5 minutes before this show, Cryptos, who lives in rural white Ontario, where these shows are set, has never heard or seen any of these. So I'm going to introduce him to Letterkenny live on air.
I've seen the ads.
No.
I've never watched them.
We're all done. We're going to introduce you live on air to a Letterkenny show, and then we're going to look at what this says about what the people who run the CBC think.
100% pure organic, grass-fed, AAA Alberta beef.
Better believe it's Alberta beef.
You got there top sirloins?
Yeah, New York's are grain-fed.
3 times the omega-3s and grass-fed.
Bought and paid for.
Well, you're going to want them aged if they're top sirloins.
Pump the brakes. 2 things. 1, now we'll let those sit for 10 to 15 minutes till they're room temperature. 2, where's the salt and pepper, bud?
Don't you fucking start.
S&P, the choice for me.
I paid a sea hare just shy of 20 for each of these sea suckers, and I will not be told how to cook them.
You paid 20 apiece for Berta beef?
Only Berta beef.
Well, no guff, but I wouldn't pay 20 apiece for Japanese Wagyu.
Always Berta beef.
Hard yes, but I wouldn't pay 20 apiece for Australian Wagyu.
Gonna want a ribeye if it's a Wagyu.
1-inch thick top sirloin, grill at 400. 4 minutes aside, down the hatch.
You are fucking up, bud.
That's textbook.
Not without the S&P.
Those fine ranchers in Alberta would be a sea hare away from not sending it here if they knew you were sprinkling salt all over the sea suckers.
You're a sea hare away from getting sea sucking socked, good buddy.
Montreal steak spice really should be part of this conversation.
1-inch thick top sirloin steak. Salt and pepper heavily. Grill at 400. 4 minutes total. Flip each mitt to get the good grill marks. Let sit for 2 minutes. Down the hatch.
Flip twice.
Grill marks, bud.
Sacrilege.
I will strike you.
Blasphemy.
Do you want to get striked?
Finish the whole thing off with a real nice herbs and garlics, buddy.
Don't fuck up my steak dinner, Derry.
Any decent shot.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
It's funny.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
It's this weird minstrel show, right? It's all the expressions, it's all the aesthetics, and yet so let's get the obvious out of the way. You're going to a barbecue at at a farmer who lives a half an hour away from where you currently live. Does it sound like that?
Absolutely not. No, actually the farmers that I would go to a half an hour from here are typically all, because they own massive quantities of land, are all multimillionaires. Yeah. And they run businesses. They send their kids to university and they learn how to do commodities training.
Yeah.
To farm pigs. So, no, that is not your typical farmer, unfortunately. Most farmers are a lot smarter than you might think, because farms are multi-million-dollar businesses and they run them accordingly. It just, that's the long and short of it. When you're spending $300,000 on a combine, you're not dealing with a bunch of backyard hicks.
Yeah.
They may wear coveralls and they may sometimes smell like the barn, but these are businessmen.
Yeah. There's so many layers to this. It's hard to kind of pick apart. I mean, the other thing that really, really sticks out about the CBC portrayal of rural Ontario, small town rural Ontario, is that it's the secular portrayal. Now, there is a secular working class in rural Ontario, but they're always living in you basically have these two groups of descended communities. One is hyper religious, one is hyper secular in rural Ontario. And in some ways, that cultural dynamic is one of the real defining dynamics of what social life in rural Ontario looks like. Because you have
that's a good way to characterize it. Yes.
Like these people, they don't go to the same schools. They don't go to the same, they have entirely parallel business networks. They're both like European descendants, but they're everything from their vocabulary to their mannerisms set them apart. And that tension and that divide, in the CBC view of rural Ontario doesn't exist.
No, and yet at the same time, like you say, if you know enough people in rural Ontario, you realize that that's a completely fake portrayal. But there are, if you look hard enough, you can find a few people that are kind of like that. And then if you take that and exaggerate it into an extreme,
you
can make, like, that is the thing about, like, most good comedy takes a perfectly ordinary situation and pushes it to the very limits between, if you're trying to be right on the boundary between funny and offensive. And so and a show like Letterkenny pushes that bounds in a sense, because the people from urban centers who watch it will not get offended by it. And people like who live out in the country who know better, like, I don't watch TV anyways, really. Like,
yeah, exactly.
For the most part,
you're not watching the CBC anyway.
I don't watch the CBC anyways, right? So, and so it's the kind of thing where, from a certain perspective, yeah, you can push the limits. Now you can create a stereotype of rural hicks that, so in a sense, then you can create a kind of politics where the CBC, the Liberal Party, and the Laurentian elite are basically here to protect you from these people. But hey, we're going to make a show about them and laugh at them a lot because it's really funny. And
I mean, I think that's
kind of
they're portrayed relatively sympathetically.
Yeah,
but
because they're you have to, because they're all of the people in these areas are good, down to earth people, salt of the earth, who would give you the shirt off of their back, and everybody kind of knows that, but yet you have to still portray them as a bunch of bumpkins who are, you can't let them into polite culture.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that definitely sticks out is that, so like one of the things about making good propaganda is first and foremost about choosing your subject, right? So if you want to create an impression of a community, you find the element of the community that you want to talk about, and you don't talk about the element of the community you don't want to talk about, right?
Exactly.
No different than
selective attention.
Yes.
And then framing.
And so you selectively attend to this community. You pull out the working class element and eliminate the business element of it. That's the thing that immediately stuck out to you, because there are working class people who work on those operations. They do exist, so you can credibly say that they do exist. You choose the secular part of that culture because that's the part that you're more comfortable with and your audience is more comfortable with. You choose the part of that. And you also choose that because the language of the secular part of that culture is going to be more. Your audience is going to connect with it more. They're going to enjoy the pieces of that language that slip into Canada's mainstream vocabulary, right? They're going to enjoy bird of beef. They're going to enjoy the accent. They're going to enjoy all of that. It's going to make them feel. It's going to make it feel authentic to them without presenting them with the parts of the vocabulary and mannerism of that people that make them uncomfortable.
Yeah, authentic Canadians are funny, and we can laugh at it all and have a good time, but not offend anybody. And but then again, at the same time, what it does is it implies so you paint this picture of it, and then the thing that's left unsaid is that everybody who votes CPC basically is like this.
Well, the other thing,
and then that's kind of the underlying message, is that, anybody who's outside of the city, they're harmless, they're fun, we love them, they're salt of the earth Canadians, but you don't want them anywhere near power.
Yeah, because based on that clip, you wouldn't want any of those people near power, right?
Do you want these guys running your country?
And they're all completely obsessed with this. They're all participants in a consumer culture, just the way you are, and it's just a different consumer culture.
Yeah, like they're obsessing over the correct way to cook a steak.
Yeah,
but also the steak also represents an aspirational thing, right? So in a sense, but it also has.
They're part of a consumer culture the way that urban Canada is part of a consumer culture, right?
Yeah.
So if you actually pulled an authentic snippet of the way that these groups of people talk to each other, you could go an hour without actually talking about a consumer item. They talk to you forever about their kids, about their grandparents, about like all kinds of issues. They would you'd have a very difficult time ever having them talk to you about the things they like to consume.
And if you're going to talk about steaks, like, because this is the kind of funny thing is that the steak is seen as an aspirational consumer item right there. Yeah. But so in real polite society, if you actually got to the point of like, okay, yeah, we're splurging and spending, we're having steaks.
Yeah, there'd
today.
Be some like self-embarrassment about it. Like all of that would be there.
Everybody, and the thing is, too, is that because steaks are expensive, everybody who's there would be very ooh, you dragged out the steaks for us, and it's kind of like, so they know that you've splurged on them. And nobody would do the whole, like, how do you correctly cook a steak kind of thing. You might have a conversation about barbecuing and steaks a little bit that way too, but it would be, this idea of, that you're most.
If you imagine yourself as part of the urban monoculture in Toronto, the people who actually watch the CBC, you're much more comfortable confronting a culture which is just like you in that it's consumer oriented. Right. The people who actually watch the CBC actually do have conversations about the things they buy if you sit in on an hour of their conversation, they're going to tell you about their Starbucks order. They're going to tell you about the clothes that they bought. They're going to tell you about the consumer elements of their life, because those are the things that are important to them. And so portraying rural Canada that way is a way of making it less alien in some strange way.
Yeah. And if you're out in the country, if people serve you steak, everybody knows it's expensive. People might complain about the cost of groceries, but nobody's gauche enough to actually talk about how much per pound you paid for your steak dinner. And that's the kind of thing people have enough manners to know that those are the types of things that you do and don't do. It's just kind of funny that you'd have a bunch of like dumb hicks out back arguing over, whether you need bird of beef or Wagyu beef or Texas Wagyu, or it's the whole conversation is just absurd, and nobody ever has this the kind of people who actually have this kind of conversation are hip urbanites.
They're the people who consume this media rather than the people who the media is about, which is what I was trying to get at. Like this show is a weird twisted mirror reflection of the CBC's actual audience.
But you can only talk about all these things, and because if you were to actually make fun of hip Toronto urbanites and have this conversation as hip Toronto, it would come off as, like they would look very, very poorly. They would come off as very, very poorly. Like, is this really how shallow you people are? and that's how it would come off. And but you can do that with the bumpkins, and nobody cares.
Well,
and you can laugh about it all.
You'd be making Zoolander Part 3, right? About Toronto, but you can't make Zoolander Part 3 about Toronto because that's you can't make fun of your own audience that much. And so what you do is you project a weird twisted image of those people out onto this population of foreigners, and then you kind of shoehorn in their vocabulary and some of the aesthetics of that population, but fill their voices with motivations that belong to an entirely different culture.
And then send the subtle message that these people should be allowed nowhere near power.
Yeah. I just think it's a fascinating, I'm going to go through a few of these clips over future episodes, but I think it's fascinating the way that, so this is an example of the consumer culture element of it. The ones that I think are also quite fascinating is when they confront organically the characters in Letterkenny with elements of progressive culture. They have this weird situation where the writers know that authentically these people would react violently. But they also know that their audience has sensibilities that can't be offended. And so you get the absurdity of rural farmers who are pro LGBTQ, right?
Never going to happen.
Yeah. One of my favorite things about Shoresy, if you go to Sudbury and talk to they introduce natives as a tough guy element in rural Canadian hockey culture. Go and ask some Sudbury guys what they actually think of the natives. You'll find all kinds of opinions that would not be fit to air on the CBC.
Yeah, no, we could probably get this show taken down too if you had I have some experience because I was actually born up north, so I have experience with those types of things.
Yeah, but instead you project the sacred values of urban Toronto onto this population and make them reflected back to you. I can't stop watching the pieces of this because I find the propaganda element so fascinating.
Remember when you could watch Beachcombers and that was good? We should do Beachcombers analysis. I like Beachcomber. See, there was that was good propaganda.
There you go.
Yeah.
Anyways, we're coming up on time here. The Red Ensign podcast episode about nothing is coming to an end. Thank you all for tuning in. Before we go, we gotta remember that Canadian propaganda wasn't always quite this bad. It had an entirely different character.
Go. Good day. I'm Bob McKin. What? As you can tell by my brother doing both parts of our theme, we got our old show back, eh? Yeah. 2 minutes. Beauty, eh? So.
Yeah, Doug and Bob were Letterkenny before there was Letterkenny.
Yeah, they absolutely were. And the interesting thing is that Doug and Bob McKenzie are authentically rural Canadian in a way that Letterkenny is not. And I think that contrast is kind of interesting.
Yeah. Red Green Show is another one that worked too as well.
Yeah. Anyways, so go and check out a few of those outside appearances that both of us have done. By the next time we podcast, we will have an English language debate to actually discuss. Although my guess is that nothing will be said there as well. And we will try to get back to looking at a deeper historical topic, looking at the kind of underlying political dynamics of this country. Thank you for your time and attention. This has been the podcast of the Red Ensign, a show about the people of Canada and their politics.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations. by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.